This is a brief primer on Marshall McLuhan and specifically covering some issues that we didn't go over as much in class. We're going to be covering excerpts from Marshall McLuhan's Understanding Media, chapters 1 and 3, the most influential book by the most debated man of the decade, the most important thinker since Newton, Darwin, Freud, Einstein, and Pavlov, says the New York Herald Tribune. That gives you a sense of how this work and how McLuhan as a thinker resonated in the 1960s. Before we address McLuhan, we should talk about one of his pupils, Father Walter Ong. Ong's thought can be helpful in parsing some of the background of understanding media. Ong's work was focused on the concept of primary orality. Primary orality refers to cultures before print in which the spoken word, was the primary means of communication. When words are printed, they're static, they're dead, they're not connected to historical events or lived in-flesh creatures. They are much more static, whereas oral traditions, there's a type of magic, action, power, and antagonism even in spoken communication. Here we see 9 features of primary orality that Ong identified. I'm not going to go through each one, but I'd just like to talk about a few in particular to help you get a better sense of what this is about. Cultures of primary orality live close to the human life world. In other words, every communication is tied to a living, breathing human being. That's not the case if you think, for example, about books. Yes, it came from an author, but you don't really contact that author in the flesh when you pick up a book and read. Primary orality is agonistic. Agonistic means that there's tension. There's a type of drama between people when they dialogue. And just think about this whenever you talk to your friend. Doesn't mean we always get in arguments, but there is a tension that develops between the desires of one speaker and the needs and desires of another. Empathetic and participatory rather than objective and distanced. The act of reading would be objective and distant. And lastly, primary orality is situational. In other words, it's connected to circumstances and events. Now, just because Ong said that we have transitioned outside of a culture of primary orality, it doesn't mean that we don't have remnants of an orally based culture in our society today. If you just think about the power of swearing an oath and that the spoken word has a type of promise and truth to it, that is a tradition that comes out of primary orality. Now, just to be clear, this notion of primary orality is Father Walter Ong's, not McLuhan's, but we can see how it corresponds to some of McLuhan's thought. Let's take, for example, a passage from McLuhan's 1967 book, The Medium is the Massage. This is a book that's parodying the first chapter of Understanding Media, which became so famous, The Medium is the Message. When McLuhan writes that the dominant organ of sensory and social orientation, the dominant organ of communication, in other words, in the pre-alphabet society was the ear, he is talking about primary orality. And what does it become? Well, then it's replaced by the alphabet. And the magic world of the ear yields to the neutral world of the eye. And this was the other part of Ong's thesis, in that primary orality diminished with the invention of the printing press. But one last piece of Ong's argument is that primary orality gives way to a literate society, which then, with the invention of the electronic media, segues into perhaps a secondary orality. This too correlates with McLuhan's thought, the transition from that book-based literate society to this new age of electronic media is the basis of the book Understanding Media. That's the ground on which the book was written. And if we look on page 15, he says we have confused reason with literacy and rationalism with a single technology. Here we can see the shift to the new age when he talks about the electric age. Man seems to the conventional West to become irrational. In other words, print has structured a way in which we think about thinking as sequenced, as linear, as propositional logic. But with electronic media, that's all changing, and it seems irrational, this new way of thinking. So he compares the experience of people living in 1960s society, transitioning from a book-based alphabetic society to an electronic age. He says it's the same as someone in a culture of primary orality walking in, for example, to a library. It's dumbfounding, and it results, according to him, in a numbness. This is also when he starts getting into the idea of auto-amputation. It's an attempt to maintain an equilibrium in order to make sense of all these new influences around us. So this is the first type of numbness. Numbness 1, a protection from shock after entering a new electronic age. Now there's also a second type of numbness, and this is why I'm going through this, because it can get a little bit confusing. On page 16 he talks about the man in a literate and homogenized society ceases to be sensitive to the diverse and discontinuous life of forms. He argues that alphabetic society, typographic society, a book-based society, because of its strict adherence to this sequential logic, we become desensitized to those more empathetic and participatory forms of human society. Print society has numbed us, according to McLuhan, because of its objective mode of communication, its analytical, abstract form of sequential logic. It's removed us from different ways of thinking and different ways of participating in lived human experience. So here we are, the two types of numbness. The first one is that numbness, that kind of dumbfounded, whoa, this is different, when we move from one age into the next. It's a type of protection device. The second numbness is this dullness that has come with the logic of the print age. So both of these forms of numbness have to do with equilibrium and a desire to maintain equilibrium. The first one, we cut ourselves off, we auto-amputate in order to be sane and continue functioning in a new age. So here we are, we've got human beings, we've got technology, and in order to preserve a equilibrium and to have a type of sanity and functionality in this world, we kind of ignore the connection here between technology and human beings. So there's a second type of equilibrium, though. It's a more positive and proactive form of equilibrium, and it comes from this quote on page 20 from a pope. It's actually a hopeful vision of society which discusses an equilibrium between the strength of the techniques of communication and the capacities of the individual's own reaction. So an equilibrium between the strength of technology and the strength of the individual. But McLuhan says that we've failed to do this for centuries. What kind of centuries? Centuries of prison walls in which we've lived. So here's my version of that numbness. We don't really know our own strength, nor do we recognize the strength of technology. We're just kind of unaware of it and continue to operate, not realizing that we are actually encircled and enclosed and limited by this failure to recognize and maintain a more active equilibrium between technology and our own strengths. Why is it a bad thing? Why is this a type of prison? Why should we be more aware of technology? Well, he says technology is like a staple, a natural resource, a fossil fuel, like oil, except it's a fossil fuel not for other technologies, but for ourselves, our own psychic life, and the psychic life of our community. And if we do not recognize the power and the effects of this staple in our lives, we in a sense don't recognize and don't understand and don't know ourselves. So the more proactive equilibrium would respect our own strengths and try to recognize the strengths of technology and maintain a more aware balance between them. And McLuhan is often accused of being optimistic because he sees in the transition to electronic age, he sees this old numbness an opportunity for it to dissipate, for it to go away. He says for the first time, human beings have become aware of technology as extensions. That is that word that he loves in the subtitle of his book, of the physical body. In other words, we become aware of our inherent intrinsic connection with technologies. This is where the discussion of cubism comes in. It's resulted in a field awareness. It's brought into vision that which for so long has been invisible. Like a cubist painting that brings to the fore the fact that this is an artist's interpretation of reality. The transition into a time of electronic media is an opportunity to get outside this second numbness, this idea that this dullness that's come with the logic of living in a print-based culture. The first kind of numbness hasn't gone away. That's why you still see passages like this on 47 where he says we become numb to our central nervous system when it's extended and exposed. Thus, the age of anxiety and electronic media is also the age of unconscious and apathy. There's definitely still this thread of numbness that runs through his discussion of electronic media. But it's a hybrid figure. It changes. It moves around. And that's why McLuhan can be hard to understand. On the very same page, on page 47, just after he talks about the apathy and unconsciousness of the age, he can sound hopeful in saying that there's a type of social consciousness that's popping up into view. Just like Cubist paintings hoik up into full view the fact that this is the artist's construction of an interpretation of reality. Our relationship with electronic media is bringing to the fore the fact that media is a staple. It is an extension of human society. And thus, there is the opportunity, instead of living in this kind of bourgeois life of being individuals and separate and numb to the rest of society, part and parcel of this new age is the possibility of recognizing that just as we are becoming more aware of our extensions with technology, we're also becoming more aware of our connections and extensions with other human beings. It's now been 40 years since the publication of Understanding Media, and McLuhan's work continues to draw new interest from audiences and readers, in large part because we are concerned about what is our relationship with social media and what does the future mean for online communities. McLuhan and Understanding Media and the ideas here are ways in which we begin to question our extensions with these new forms of electronic media.